For his Police Academy screen test, Steve Guttenberg didn't rehearse a monologue. He borrowed his father's actual police shirt, the one Stanley Guttenberg had genuinely worn on the job, and walked into the room wearing it like it belonged to him. Right away, he had an attitude which was perfect, he said later, and the casting directors knew instantly they'd found their Mahoney. What almost nobody talks about is the other actor in that academy who spent 40 years being cast as the man determined to throw Mahoney out, and the private tragedy sitting behind his own performance the whole time. Now, decades later, Steve Guttenberg has finally said what he actually thinks of G.W. Bailey, and it isn't what anyone expected. Stephen Robert Guttenberg was born on August 24, 1958, in Borough Park, Brooklyn, and raised in North Massapequa, Long Island, after his family relocated out of the city. His father, Stanley, had served as an Army Ranger with the 82nd Airborne Division and later worked as a New York City policeman, a man who could have been intimidating, but chose instead to be endlessly present, always home at the end of the day, rather than out with the boys. When 17-year-old Steve announced he wanted to move to Los Angeles and become an actor, Stanley sat at the foot of his bed the next morning and simply told him it was a good choice, that they'd both get to see what came next. Steve had already spent summers studying at Juilliard under acting teacher John Houseman and landed a small off-Broadway role in The Lion in Winter while still in high school, but none of that prepared him for what came next. In 1976, fresh out of Plain Edge High School, Steve made the leap west with $300, salami his mother packed for the road, and his father's old briefcase, given 2 weeks to find work before he'd need to come home. He made the deadline, landing a Kentucky Fried Chicken commercial within days, then spent months sneaking onto studio lots at Paramount, Universal, and Fox, using nothing but a blank employee time card and pure nerve, since there were no computers or cell phones back then to catch him, just a guard with a telephone watching the gate. At 20 years old, that hustle landed him a role opposite Laurence Olivier, Gregory Peck, and James Mason in The Boys from Brazil, an experience that taught him something he'd repeat for the rest of his career, that the more successful and respected the actor, the kinder and more understanding they usually turned out to be. Barry Levinson's Diner in 1982 gave him his first real showcase, an ensemble piece alongside Mickey Rourke, Daniel Stern, and Kevin Bacon that critics later said felt less like acting and more like watching a group of real friends who'd known each other for years. Steve landed Eddie Simmons by opening up in the audition about his own long-distance relationship, and that vulnerability gave the character genuine authenticity. A young man who was sweet and smart underneath the jokes, but visibly insecure about it. The studio nearly shelved the entire film until Levinson secretly screened it for influential critic Pauline Kael, who loved it enough to change the film's fate overnight. The film has since been ranked among the American Film Institute's funniest movies ever made. The following year, over 100 million people watched him in the ABC nuclear war drama The Day After, a broadcast President Reagan himself reportedly watched. and one that sparked national debate about the threat of nuclear conflict, proving Steve could carry serious, weighty material and not just charm. Then, in 1984, everything exploded. Producer Paul Maslansky has told the story of where the entire police academy concept actually began, watching a genuinely diverse group of real police recruits being used for crowd control in San Francisco, men and women of every size and color, and asking the sergeant in charge how such an unusual mix had been assembled. The sergeant explained they were legally required to accept nearly everyone who applied, then winked and added that they could still flunk most of them out within 3 weeks. Maslansky went home that night wondering what would happen if a group like that simply refused to be thrown out. Casting the ensemble became, in his own words, one of the great experiences of his career, describing it as more like a team project than any film he'd worked on, with director Hugh Wilson and casting directors Pamela Baskin and Fern Champion getting genuinely excited every single time a new, remarkable personality walked through the door. Steve's own audition became one of those stories. Fresh off diner, he walked in wearing his father's real police shirt from Stanley's actual years on the force, and the effect was immediate. Right away he had an attitude which was perfect, was how the moment got described afterward. The screen test so natural, it barely felt like acting at all. He didn't try to make Mahoney anything more than what he was on the page, a street-smart guy who genuinely didn't know what he wanted to do with his life, equal parts charming and irreverent, the relatively normal audience surrogate, guiding viewers through everyone else's chaos, a classic Bugs Bunny type who loved finding the good in people while still being just selfish enough to feel human. Around the same time, casting director Fern Champion had heard about a stand-up comedian named Michael Winslow opening for Count Basie in Long Beach, and when the casting team arrived to see him perform, the ballroom's microphone died completely before he even started. Winslow didn't hesitate. He grabbed a fire marshal's bullhorn from the room and performed his entire act through it anyway, bringing the house down so completely that Count Basie himself was reportedly knocked out by it. Winslow's habit of narrating everyday life in sound effects never actually switched off once cameras stopped rolling either, castmates recalling him ordering food or asking for the salt at restaurants, complete with full mechanical noises attached. A running joke on set that Steve has said only made him funnier to be around, not less. Then there was G.W. Bailey, cast as the pompous, easily wounded Lieutenant Harris, the man whose entire job was making Mahoney's life miserable. Steve has described their on-screen dynamic in blunt, affectionate terms decades later. G.W. is my authority figure, he's said, the one trying to make it hard for me, trying to get me kicked out of the academy. But he's also been clear that the character could have gone flat in lesser hands, and that Bailey instead turned Harris into something genuinely lovable to hate, a classic martinet playing the perfect foil, someone audiences loved despising precisely because Bailey clearly loved playing him. Bailey himself has joked about the role with the same self-aware humor, insisting in interviews that he was never actually mean, just misunderstood, a mama's boy underneath the uniform. Producer Paul Maslansky has called the entire casting process one of the great experiences of his career, describing it as more like a team project than any film he'd worked on, a set where every actor who walked through the door seemed to arrive with their own fully formed, slightly unhinged personality already intact. From George Gaynes building his bumbling Commandant Lassard around the spirit of a beloved European film comedian, to Donovan Scott landing his role by literally flipping through the audition room door and sticking the landing on his back mid-joke. Critics, when the film finally opened, absolutely tore it apart. Roger Ebert gave it 0 stars and called it spectacularly awful. Audiences didn't care in the slightest. Police Academy became the 6th highest-grossing film of 1984, launching a franchise that would define both men's careers for the rest of the decade. One built as much on castmates like Bailey and Winslow finding real chemistry together as on anything written on the page. Steve returned for 3 sequels, cementing himself as the face of the series before wisely stepping away to avoid being trapped in Mahoney's uniform forever. But 1985 brought something completely different. Ron Howard's Cocoon paired him with genuine Hollywood royalty: Don Amici, Wilford Brimley, Hume Cronin, Jessica Tandy, and Maureen Stapleton, in a prestige science fiction drama about a group of elderly residents who discover a pool that makes them young again. Steve believed in the project so deeply, he reportedly worked for less than his usual fee just to be part of it. And the film went on to win 2 Academy Awards, becoming both a critical and commercial success that earned over $85 million. A year later, Short Circuit turned him into a hero for an entire generation of kids, playing the robotics engineer whose military creation gets struck by lightning and becomes sentient, a role built on pure, uncomplicated decency that made "Number 5 is alive" a genuine childhood catchphrase, the film eventually becoming a cable television staple that played endlessly throughout the late 80s and 90s. 1987 became his absolute peak. The Bedroom Window, a stylish Hitchcockian thriller directed by Curtis Hanson, let him prove real dramatic range as a man tangled in a web of lies and danger after witnessing a crime through his lover's window, a performance fans still call criminally underrated, and one that showed critics who dismissed him as just a comedy guy that there was more range underneath the charm than anyone had credited him for. Then came 3 Men and a Baby, alongside Tom Selleck and Ted Danson, a film that became the highest-grossing release of the entire year, outperforming Fatal Attraction, Beverly Hills Cop 2, Lethal Weapon, and RoboCop combined at the domestic box office, pulling in over $167 million. It was a cultural event. Everyone saw it, everyone quoted it, and Steve Guttenberg was officially a movie star, even if, as he admitted candidly in interviews at the time, he was never much of a partier compared to his co-stars, joking that his idea of a good night was watching sports and eating pizza, and that despite being the youngest of the 3 leads, he somehow felt like the oldest. He returned for the 1990 sequel, 3 Men and a Little Lady, which performed respectably, even if it never quite matched the cultural lightning of the original. When the 90s arrived, Hollywood's appetite shifted hard toward edgier, more complicated leading men, and Steve's particular brand of warmth lost currency almost overnight. He turned to family films and smaller projects, directed a little-seen adaptation in 2002, and watched former co-stars like Danson and Selleck keep thriving while he became, in his own words, something closer to a punchline shorthand for a simpler, more dated kind of movie star. He's said the industry mistook his niceness for weakness of character, and that he was reluctant for years to chase darker material as a result, a hesitation he's admitted probably cost him professionally, even as he continued working steadily across television guest spots, stage productions, and the occasional beloved cult oddity that kept his name alive with a new generation discovering him for the first time. Through all of it, one relationship never wavered. His father, Stanley, remained his anchor for the rest of his life, and when Stanley developed serious kidney failure, requiring constant dialysis, Steve began driving 400 miles round trip from Los Angeles to Phoenix every single week to help care for him, stepping away from his own career at its own moments of opportunity, without a second thought, treating the drive itself as simply part of who he was, rather than a sacrifice worth complaining about. "My dad was always there for me," Steve has said. "I was in love with my dad. He was my best friend." In July of 2022, Stanley died at 89, with Steve holding him, performing CPR, unable to accept what was happening, even as it happened right in front of him. "I probably let him go a year later," he admitted afterward. "It's hard to believe that he's gone." He poured that grief into a memoir called Time to Thank, and a one-man stage show called Tales from the Guttenberg Bible, which he's described simply as a way of still talking to his father even now, every time he performs it. It's against that backdrop, decades after Police Academy wrapped, and long after the jokes about Mahoney and Harris had settled into convention circuit nostalgia, that Steve has finally spoken with real weight about what he's since learned about the man who spent 4 films trying to throw him out of the Academy. For years, G.W. Bailey was simply the villain, the perfect foil, the guy audiences loved to hate. What Steve has come to understand is the private tragedy Bailey was quietly carrying the entire time, one that never once came up on set between takes or during any of their decades of convention reunions. In 1982, the very same year Steve was filming Diner, Bailey's own goddaughter, a young girl named Brandy Aldridge, was diagnosed with leukemia. Watching her and the other children she met through treatment fight for their lives reshaped the rest of Bailey's life, permanently stripping away whatever illusions he still carried about which parts of a successful acting career actually mattered. He began volunteering with a small Houston nonprofit called the Sunshine Kids Foundation, spending more than 15 years working alongside families living through exactly what Brandy's family endured, showing up for hospital visits and fundraisers long before anyone in Hollywood knew or cared, before eventually becoming the organization's executive director in 2001, a role he held for nearly 2 decades until 2019. Brandy herself died of leukemia at just 17 years old. Bailey's entire second career quietly running an organization that has given thousands of young cancer patients trips, activities, and a few days of feeling like ordinary kids again, became an ongoing, unspoken tribute to a goddaughter he lost far too young, running silently alongside every convention appearance and every Police Academy reunion interview, where the public only ever saw him as the funny guy playing the villain. That's the context Steve carries with him now, every time he talks about their decades-long friendship. The man who spent 4 movies chasing him through Academy hallways for laughs was off-camera spending nearly 30 years showing up for children nobody else in Hollywood was paying attention to. Steve has said that learning the full scope of it changed how he sees their entire shared history. that the same warmth Bailey brought to turning Harris into someone audiences loved despite themselves was the exact same warmth he brought to a children's hospital ward for 2 decades without ever making it part of his public persona. It reframes everything Steve has suggested about what it actually meant to spend the 80s standing across from a man that generous and never fully realizing it until 40 years later, long after both of their own fathers were gone, and both of them had learned in their own separate ways exactly what it costs to keep showing up for someone else's pain. Today, Steve Guttenberg still lives in Pacific Palisades, California, the same community he's called home for over 3 decades. When wildfires tore through the neighborhood in January of 2025, he didn't evacuate quietly. As nearly 200 drivers abandoned their cars and fled on foot, Steve moved vehicles, cleared paths for emergency crews, and helped neighbors escape. The same instinct for showing up that defined his years driving to Phoenix for his father. His Instagram bio, seen by nearly 500,000 followers, simply reads, "Actor, writer, sandwich maker," filled with quiet, thoughtful posts about kindness and gratitude that read exactly like the man on screen decades ago. Except, as he said himself, it was never really an act to begin with. What makes the Bailey revelation land so hard now isn't just the tragedy itself. It's the timing of when Steve finally understood it. 2 men who spent nearly a decade of their lives in matching uniforms, trading pratfalls and insults for the camera, both quietly carrying enormous private grief the entire time. Bailey, for a goddaughter he lost at 17, at 66, James Spader finally reveals biggest reason he escaped from Hollywood. Steve, for a father, he held while performing CPR decades later. Neither one used the other's set visits or convention reunions to talk about it. They simply kept showing up, kept being funny, kept letting audiences believe the whole relationship began and ended with a police academy that never actually existed. Nice guys, it turns out, don't always finish last. Sometimes they just take 40 years to tell you what the guy standing next to them was actually made of the whole time. There are decades more hiding behind those old convention circuit jokes than most fans ever stop to consider, and we'll keep pulling back the curtain on the real bonds behind the comedies you grew up loving, because the truths behind those old laughs deserve to be remembered too.